The Golden Nugget's aged floorboards creaked beneath Lucky Harrison's boots as he pushed away from his table, whiskey bottle dangling loosely from his fingers. His gang, 5 hard-faced men who'd ridden with him since the Kansas Territory, spread out instinctively, years of bar fights having taught them how to control a room. The afternoon sunlight filtering through the dusty windows caught the dull gleam of gunmetal as hands casually dropped to holsters. "Asked you a question, mister," Harrison drawled, closing the distance to the bar. "Ain't polite to ignore a friendly conversation." He was a tall man, made taller by the high-heeled boots he favored, with a face weathered by sun and violence. The knife scar running from his left ear to his jaw twitched as he spoke, a souvenir from a Dodge City card game that had earned him his nickname. He'd been lucky to survive it. The stranger set his glass down carefully, turning to face Harrison with unhurried movements. His eyes, a pale blue that seemed almost colorless in the saloon's dim light, met Harrison's with calm intensity. From behind the bar, Jenny Miller found herself holding her breath, recognizing the kind of silence that often preceded violence in Dogwood Creek. "Boys," Harrison called out to his men, though his gaze never left the stranger's face. "Think we got ourselves a proud one here. Too good to talk to common folk like us?" He took another step closer, close enough now that the smell of trail dust and cheap whiskey hung between them. "Maybe we ought to teach him some manners." Sheriff Hawkins, watching from across the street, saw the Billy Chen, the Golden Nugget's elderly owner, quietly slip out the side door. The old man had survived 3 decades on the frontier by knowing when trouble was brewing, and he was heading straight for the sheriff's office. But Hawkins stayed put, something in his lawman's instincts telling him to wait and watch. Inside, the stranger made a series of deliberate gestures with his hands that Sarah Cooper, still observing from her doorway, would later recognize as the sign language used by some of the deaf children at the territorial school in Cheyenne. Of course, to Harrison and his men, it meant nothing. "Look at that, boys." Harrison's laugh held the sharp edge of cruelty. "He's dancing for us now." He thrust his whiskey bottle forward, sloshing its contents across the stranger's vest. "Here's something to help you find your voice, dancer." What happened next would be recounted in saloons across 3 territories, though few would believe it until they saw the man himself in action. The stranger's hand moved with such speed that several witnesses would later swear he never actually drew his gun. One moment Harrison was grinning, whiskey bottle extended. The next, that same bottle exploded into glittering shards, the sharp crack of the Colt's report still echoing off the walls. The stranger had drawn, fired, and returned his gun to its holster in one fluid motion, the bullet passing so close to Harrison's hand that it left a thin line of burned skin across his knuckles. More impressive still, he'd done it cross-handed, drawing from his left side holster with his right hand, while using his body to shield the movement. Dead silence fell over the Golden Nugget. Harrison stood frozen, drops of whiskey and blood from small cuts caused by the flying glass dripping from his trembling hand. His men had their hands on their guns but seemed uncertain, recognizing that they'd just witnessed something beyond their experience. The stranger reached into his vest pocket with careful deliberation, maintaining eye contact with Harrison as he withdrew a small slate and piece of chalk. The soft scratch of chalk on slate seemed unnaturally loud in the tense quiet. He held up the slate, its message clear in precise handwriting. "Next time, I aim higher." But Lucky Harrison hadn't earned his reputation by backing down easily, and as the blood from his cut hand dripped onto the sawdust-covered floor, his humiliation began to transform into a darker kind of anger, the kind that had left men dead in towns across the territory. The afternoon's entertainment was about to become something far more dangerous, and everyone in the Golden Nugget knew it. Subscribe to catch the next part of this incredible tale, where we'll see just how deadly silence can be when backed by the fastest draw in the Wyoming Territory. Outside the Golden Nugget, Sheriff Tom Hawkins shifted his weight, causing his porch chair to creak ominously. In 15 years of wearing a badge, He'd developed an almost supernatural sense for when a situation was about to explode. Billy Chen had already started quietly ushering the more sensible patrons out the saloon's side door, their afternoon drinks forgotten in the face of impending violence. "Ain't a man alive can outdraw Lucky," Sarah Cooper would later recall one of Harrison's men muttering, though his trembling voice suggested he was trying to convince himself more than anyone else. "Seen him kill 3 men in Socorro last spring, all of them thinking they were faster." Inside the saloon, Lucky Harrison's face had turned the color of storm clouds. The whiskey and blood dripping from his cut hand had formed a small, dark puddle in the sawdust at his feet. His eyes, bloodshot from 3 days of drinking, fixed on the slate still held in the stranger's steady hands. "Think you're clever, do you?" Harrison's voice had dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Think because you can shoot a bottle, you're ready to face a real gunman?" He flexed his bleeding hand, drops of crimson falling from his fingertips. "I've killed 23 men, friend. Each one of them thought they were special, too." The stranger calmly erased his previous message with his sleeve and wrote something new. The chalk's soft scratching seemed to draw every eye in the room. He held up the slate again. "Walk away. No one needs to die today." Jenny Miller, who'd retreated behind the relative safety of the bar, would later swear she saw something flicker across Harrison's face. Not fear, exactly, but the kind of recognition predators show when they realize they might not be the most dangerous thing in the room. It passed quickly, buried beneath wounded pride and whiskey courage. "Boys," Harrison called out, never taking his eyes off the stranger. "Clear some space. Seems our silent friend here needs a lesson in respect." His gang began pushing tables aside, creating an open area in the center of the saloon. The few remaining patrons pressed themselves against the walls, none wanting to be caught in what was coming. The stranger shook his head slowly, wrote one more message: "Your choice." Then he set the slate down on the bar with deliberate care. Jenny Miller would later testify that she'd never seen hands so steady. "High noon's a bit traditional for my taste," Harrison announced, his voice carrying the practiced theatricality of a man who enjoyed an audience. "Let's say you walk outside, take 10 paces, turn and draw. Simple enough even for a mute to understand." He paused, letting his cruel smile widen. "Unless you'd prefer to apologize. Might even let you keep your gun if you get down on your knees and beg proper." The stranger's response was to pick up his hat from the bar, a black, flat-brimmed affair that had seen its share of weather, and settle it carefully on his head. The movement was unhurried, almost peaceful, like a man preparing for a Sunday stroll rather than a gunfight. Sheriff Hawkins had seen enough. He pushed himself up from his chair, hand resting casually on his gun belt. But before he could cross the street, he caught a subtle gesture from the stranger through the saloon window, a small wave-off that spoke volumes. The message was clear. This was personal now. "Tom." Sarah Cooper had appeared at his elbow, her voice low. "You know Lucky's gang won't let it end clean, even if their boss loses fair." Hawkins nodded grimly. "Already sent Billy to round up Deputy Wells and anyone else with a steady hand and a sense of duty. But Sarah—" He paused, watching the stranger's calm preparations through the window. "I've got a feeling Lucky Harrison's about to learn why you don't judge a man by his silence." Inside the Golden Nugget, the air had grown thick with tension. Harrison's men had positioned themselves strategically around the room, their hands never far from their guns. But the stranger seemed to take no notice, maintaining that same eerie calm as he moved towards the door. His spurs made no sound on the wooden floor, another detail that witnesses would later recall with a shiver. The afternoon sun was about to witness either the birth of a legend or the death of a fool. In Dogwood Creek, there was rarely any middle ground. Dogwood Creek's main street had grown unnaturally quiet, the usual afternoon bustle giving way to tense anticipation. Shopkeepers quietly ushered customers inside, mothers hurried their children home, and men who normally wouldn't miss a gunfight found urgent business elsewhere. They'd all seen what happened when Lucky Harrison was crossed, and none wanted to risk becoming collateral damage in what was sure to be more than a simple duel. The sun hung high and harsh in the Wyoming sky, turning the street's packed dirt into a mirror of shimmering heat waves. Deputy Wells, responding to Billy Chen's warning, had positioned himself on the roof of the general store, his Winchester laid carefully across the false front. From his vantage point, he could see 3 of Harrison's men similarly stationed on nearby buildings, their presence confirming Sarah Cooper's prediction that this wouldn't end with a simple face-off. There was something in the air, Wells would later write in his report to the territorial marshal. Like the heaviness before a thunderstorm, when you can taste the lightning coming but don't know where it'll strike. The stranger emerged first from the Golden Nugget, the batwing doors swinging silently behind him. He paused on the wooden sidewalk, his pale eyes scanning the rooflines and shadows with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to looking for trouble. Sheriff Hawkins, watching from his position near the hotel, noticed how the stranger's gaze lingered briefly on each of Harrison's hidden men, marking their positions without giving away his awareness. Lucky Harrison followed moments later, his gang spreading out behind him like a deadly fan. The whiskey bottle's cuts had stopped bleeding, but his hand still showed an angry red line where the stranger's bullet had passed close enough to burn. He'd shed his coat, revealing a gun belt that bore notches, too many to count at a glance, each one representing a man who'd underestimated him. "Might still walk away from this," Harrison called out, his voice carrying the false friendliness of a snake's rattle. "Ain't no shame in admitting you're outmatched. Well, not much shame anyway." His men laughed dutifully, the sound echoing hollowly down the empty street. The stranger's response was to remove his duster, folding it with careful precision and placing it on a nearby hitching post. The movement revealed not just the pearl-handled Colt, but a second gun on his right hip, a newer model Remington conversion that looked as well-maintained as its companion. More telling was the way his clothes had been tailored to allow for a clean draw from either side, suggesting a man who'd put considerable thought into the art of staying alive. Jenny Miller, watching from the saloon window, would later tell her sister that the stranger's face showed no expression at all. Not courage, not fear, just a deep, almost peaceful focus that seemed more frightening than any display of emotion could have been. 10 paces, Harrison announced, moving to position himself in the street. "Turn and fire. Simple enough even for a man with no tongue to understand." He paused, his cruel smile returning. "Unless you'd rather just kneel now and get it over with." The stranger stepped off the sidewalk, his boots raising small puffs of dust. He gave no indication that he'd heard Harrison's taunts, maintaining that same unnerving calm. His right hand hung loose at his side, not hovering near his guns but ready to move at a moment's notice. Sarah Cooper, watching from her restaurant's doorway, found herself holding her breath. She'd seen her share of gunfights in Dogwood Creek, but something about this one felt different. The stranger's silence seemed to have infected the whole town, creating a vacuum of anticipation that would soon be filled with either victory or death. Sheriff Hawkins shifted his weight slightly, causing his own gun belt to creak. He'd positioned himself to have a clear shot at Harrison's men on the rooftops, knowing that whatever happened between the two principals, the real danger would come from the aftermath. His fingers drummed unconsciously on his holster as he watched the 2 men take their positions, knowing that Dogwood Creek was about to witness either the end of Lucky Harrison's reign of terror or another notch on the gunman's belt. But as the opponents prepared to turn their backs on each other for the traditional paces, nobody in Dogwood Creek suspected that they were about to witness something that would be talked about in whispers for decades to come. The day silence proved deadlier than any shouted challenge. Time seemed to slow as the 2 men stood back to back in the center of Dogwood Creek's main street. The afternoon heat had become oppressive, the air so thick it felt like breathing through wet cotton. Deputy Wells, still positioned on the general store's roof, would later swear he could hear the creak of gun leather from 50 yards away. So complete was the silence that had fallen over the town. "Count the paces," Harrison called out to his men, his voice carrying a theatrical confidence that didn't quite mask an undercurrent of tension. "When you reach 10, give us the signal." One of Harrison's gang, a scarred man known only as Mexican Joe, began the count in a voice that carried clearly in the still air. 1. The opponents took their first steps away from each other, their boot heels raising small puffs of dust from the sun-baked street. 2. Sarah Cooper, watching from her doorway, noticed something odd about the stranger's gait, a subtle difference in how he placed his feet, as if he were measuring each step with scientific precision. 3. Sheriff Hawkins's experienced eye caught it too. The stranger wasn't just walking. He was calculating, each step perfectly gauged to cover a specific distance. It was the kind of detail that separated professionals from common gunmen. 4. Lucky Harrison, for all his swagger, must have sensed something was different too. His next step came with a slight hesitation, like a man who suddenly realized he might have miscalculated. 5. Jenny Miller, still watching from the saloon window, would later recall how the stranger's hands remained perfectly still at his sides, while Harrison's had begun to twitch slightly near his holster. 6. Deputy Wells adjusted his grip on his Winchester, noting how Harrison's men on the rooftops had shifted their positions, preparing for what they assumed would be the aftermath of their boss's victory. 7. The stranger's head tilted slightly, like a man listening to something only he could hear. Later, Billy Chen would insist that he'd seen a faint smile cross the mute man's face at that moment. 8. Harrison's confidence finally cracked. Instead of taking the 8th step, he spun early, his hand dropping to his gun with the speed that had earned him his reputation across 3 territories. "Gun!" Sarah Cooper's warning shout split the air, but it was unnecessary. The stranger had begun his turn the instant Harrison's boot heel had scraped against the dirt, as if he'd been expecting the betrayal. What happened next would be debated in saloons across the West for years to come, with each telling becoming more elaborate than the last. But those who were there, who witnessed it with their own eyes, would never forget what they saw. The stranger's draw was unlike anything Dogwood Creek had ever seen. There was no wasted motion, no flourish, just liquid speed that seemed to defy natural law. His right hand dropped to his left side holster in a cross-draw that was almost too fast to follow, while his left hand simultaneously drew the Remington from his right hip. Harrison managed to clear leather with his first gun, but his shot went wild as 2 simultaneous reports from the stranger's pistols split the air. The first bullet struck Harrison's gun hand with surgical precision, sending his weapon spinning into the dust. The second shot punched through his right shoulder, spinning him halfway around before he collapsed to his knees. The entire exchange had taken less than 2 seconds, but the danger wasn't over. Harrison's men on the rooftops had begun to raise their rifles, and his gang members in the street were reaching for their guns. The stranger's guns had shifted targets before Harrison even hit the ground, each weapon aimed in a different direction, making it impossible for anyone to guess which threat he'd address first. "Hold!" Sheriff Hawkins's command cracked like a whip in the stunned silence that followed the shooting. "Next man who moves gets to see if he's faster than me and him." He jerked his head toward the stranger, whose guns remained unwavering in their deadly promise. The afternoon seemed to hold its breath as Harrison's men weighed their options, their loyalty to their fallen leader battling with their sudden appreciation of their own mortality. But Dogwood Creek's ordeal was far from over. Lucky Harrison had survived worse wounds, and his reputation wouldn't allow him to let this humiliation stand. The day's violence had only just begun. Blood spread across the dust of Dogwood Creek's main street, turning the dry earth dark beneath Lucky Harrison's kneeling form. The wounded gunman's breath came in ragged gasps, his left hand clutching his shattered right shoulder while his gun lay useless in the dirt beside him. His eyes, though glazed with pain, burned with a hatred that promised this wasn't over. "Doc Matthews," Sheriff Hawkins called out, his own gun still trained on Harrison's men. "Think your services are required." The town's physician had been watching from his office doorway, already preparing his instruments when he'd heard the shots. He approached cautiously, his black medical bag clutched tight in weathered hands. The stranger's guns remained perfectly steady, covering both the rooftops and the street-level threats with an ease that spoke of long practice. Deputy Wells, still positioned above the general store, couldn't help but admire the professional economy of the man's stance. No wasted movement, no theatrical posturing, just the calm readiness of someone who'd done this many times before. "Somebody get the boss inside," Mexican Joe called out, his voice carrying a nervous edge. But none of Harrison's men seemed eager to be the first to move, well aware that those unwavering gun barrels would track any motion. The stranger's left hand dipped slightly, gesturing toward Doc Matthews's office with a subtle movement that somehow managed to be both suggestion and command. The meaning was clear. Harrison's men could help their boss, but any deviation from a direct path to the doctor's would be met with immediate consequences. "Easy now," Sheriff Hawkins advised as two of Harrison's gang members slowly moved to assist their fallen leader. "Straight to the docks, then I want the rest of you over at the jail. We're going to have us a civilized discussion about the future of Dogwood Creek." Sarah Cooper, still watching from her doorway, saw something in the stranger's stance that the others missed. "Tom," she called out softly to the sheriff, "roof behind the saloon." The stranger had already noticed. Without taking his eyes off the men in front of him, he squeezed off a shot from his left-hand gun that sent splinters flying from the wooden railing where another of Harrison's men had been trying to find a better firing position. The would-be assassin scrambled back, leaving his rifle behind. "Mighty fine shooting," Deputy Wells muttered from his perch, genuinely impressed. "Never seen anyone handle two guns with that kind of accuracy." Harrison, being half carried toward the doctor's office, suddenly found his voice through the pain. "You're dead," he snarled at the stranger. "Might take a day, might take a week, but you're a dead man walking. Nobody humiliates Lucky Harrison and lives to brag about it." The stranger's response was to holster his right-hand Colt with fluid grace, draw out his slate, and write a message that he held up for Harrison to read. "Can't brag without a voice." Something in the simple statement, combined with the casual deadliness of its author, sent a shiver through the watching crowd. Here was a man who didn't need words to make his point, who let his actions speak with lethal eloquence. Doc Matthews, examining Harrison's wounds as his men eased him onto a treatment table, would later recall that it was the cleanest shooting he'd ever seen. "Both bullets placed with surgical precision," he'd write in his medical journal. "One to disarm, one to disable, but neither shot meant to kill, the kind of skill that comes from something darker than simple practice." Outside, the tension began to ease as Harrison's men, realizing they had no appetite for further violence against this silent destroyer of reputations, gradually made their way toward the jail. Sheriff Hawkins maintained his vigilance, knowing that desperate men could still make foolish choices. The stranger finally holstered his second gun, though his easy stance suggested he could have them out again in the space between heartbeats. He retrieved his slate once more, writing a message for the sheriff. He'll try again. Men like him always do. Hawkins nodded grimly. "Reckon you'll be staying in town a spell then?" The stranger's response was simple. "Until it's finished." But as the afternoon shadows lengthened across Dogwood Creek, those who knew Lucky Harrison's reputation understood that this was just the opening move in a deadlier game. The stranger's silence had won the first round, but Harrison's wounded pride would demand satisfaction, and next time he wouldn't bother with the pretense of a fair fight. As evening settled over Dogwood Creek, rumors about the silent stranger spread through the town like wildfire. In Sarah Cooper's restaurant, where the day's events were being dissected over coffee and apple pie, theories multiplied with each telling. Some claimed he was a former Army scout. Others whispered about a mysterious gunfighter from Texas who never spoke, but never missed. A traveling salesman swore he'd heard tales of a mute avenger working his way up from Mexico, leaving dead men and shattered reputations in his wake. Sheriff Hawkins sat in his office, watching his deputy process Harrison's sullen men into the jail's crowded cells. The stranger's slate lay on his desk, its most recent message still visible. "Wire Marshal Jensen in Denver. He can tell you who I am." The response had arrived just as the sun was setting, its terse contents causing Hawkins to whistle softly through his teeth. "Town council needs to hear this," he muttered, reaching for his tobacco pouch with slightly unsteady hands. Meanwhile, Doc Matthews was discovering that treating Lucky Harrison was like trying to doctor a wounded mountain lion. "The shoulder wound's clean through," he reported to Mexican Joe, who'd been allowed to stay and guard his boss. "But these hand injuries—" He paused, studying the precision damage to Harrison's gun hand. Never seen shooting like this. He hit exactly the right tendons to make sure you won't be drawing fast for a long while, Lucky. Harrison's response was a stream of profanity that caused the doctor to step back instinctively. Joe, the wounded gunman growled, get word to Carter's place. Tell him I'm calling in that marker he owes me. Mexican Joe's weather-beaten face paled slightly. Boss, Carter's bunch, they ain't exactly subtle. Whole town'll know if they ride in. Good. Harrison's smile was terrible to behold. Let them know. Let everybody know what happens when someone makes a fool of Lucky Harrison. The stranger, seemingly oblivious to the plotting against him, had taken a room at the Golden Nugget. Jenny Miller, bringing up his evening meal, found him seated by the window methodically cleaning his guns with the precise attention of a surgeon preparing instruments. His slate rested nearby, and he paused in his work to write her a message. Thank you. Any word from the jail? Harrison's men are quiet, she reported, setting down the tray. But Billy Chen says he saw Mexican Joe riding hard east just after sunset. Folks are saying... She hesitated, then continued in a rush. They're saying you're him. The ghost that hunted down the Mason gang last year. The one they call the Silent Judge. The stranger's pale eyes met hers for a moment, neither confirming nor denying. He wrote again, best stay away from the restaurant tomorrow. Down at the jail, Deputy Wells was changing guard shifts when he noticed something odd about Harrison's men. They seemed almost cheerful despite their cramped accommodations. His years wearing a badge had taught him that when prisoners started looking happy, trouble wasn't far behind. Sarah Cooper was closing up her restaurant when Sheriff Hawkins appeared at her door, his face grave. Just got word, he said without preamble. Carter's gang was spotted crossing the territorial line this morning. 30 hard cases, all of them owing Lucky favors. Tom, she replied, her voice steady despite her obvious concern. You need to know something. That stranger, I recognize those hand signs he was making. My late husband learned them at Gettysburg after a Confederate shell took his hearing. They're not just random gestures, they're military signals. The sheriff nodded slowly. Marshal Jensen's wire confirmed it. Our silent friend was a scout during the war, specialized in deep reconnaissance. After the fighting ended, he kept right on scouting. Only then it was for the law instead of the army. Until something happened that took his voice and gave him a new purpose. Hawkins gazed out at the darkening street. Jensen says he's been hunting bad men across 4 territories, building quite a reputation among those who know to watch for him. Never kills unless he has to, but when he does... The night wind carried the sound of distant hoofbeats, drawing both their attention. Somewhere out in the darkness, Carter's riders were getting closer to Dogwood Creek with every passing minute. The real test of the stranger's skills was about to begin, and this time it wouldn't be a simple street duel. The whole town was about to become a battlefield. They say the deadliest sound in the West isn't the rattler's warning or the coyote's howl. It's the silence that comes before a killing shot. In the years following the Civil War, when territory lines were drawn in blood and justice wore a 6-shooter on its hip, legends were born in whispers and died in thundering gunfire. But perhaps no legend grew quite as quietly as that of Michael Silent Shaw, a man whose inability to speak didn't hamper his ability to send men to their graves. Some claimed he'd lost his voice to a Comanche arrow. Others swore it was the horrors of Gettysburg that stole his words. But all agreed on one thing. His Colt spoke clearly enough for any man foolish enough to test him. Join me today as we delve into the story of the man they called the Silent Shot, whose reputation was built not on boasts or threats, but on the deadly accuracy that made him the most feared marksman in a territory where accuracy meant survival. If you're enjoying this tale of the Old West, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's story might just be even more incredible. Dogwood Creek, Wyoming Territory, summer of 1875. The town wasn't much more than a collection of sun-bleached buildings huddled against the foothills of the Medicine Bow Mountains, where cattle drives and mining claims brought a steady stream of rough men with rough manners. The kind of place where a man's worth was measured by the speed of his draw and the strength of his nerve. Sarah Cooper, owner of the town's only proper restaurant, would later recall the day Shaw rode in. There was something different about him, she'd write in her journal. Not just the fact that he didn't speak, but the way he carried himself. Most men who come through Dogwood Creek either swagger like kings or slink like coyotes. He just was. The stranger's arrival didn't go unnoticed by Sheriff Tom Hawkins, who'd spent 15 years wearing a badge and had developed an eye for trouble. He watched from his office porch as the newcomer dismounted outside the Golden Nugget Saloon, taking note of the well-maintained Winchester in its saddle scabbard and the pearl-handled Colt worn cross-draw style. The man's clothes were trail-dusty but good quality, a dark brown duster, black vest, and boots that had seen plenty of miles but clearly started life in some big-city cobbler's shop. Might have been the cleanest gun belt I'd ever seen, Hawkins would later testify. Not just well-oiled, but worn with the kind of care that spoke of a man who understood that his life might depend on it. Made me wonder what kind of life would teach a man to be that particular about his tools. Inside the Golden Nugget, the afternoon crowd was just beginning to gather. Wade Lucky Harrison and his gang of ranch hands occupied their usual corner table, fresh off a cattle drive and flush with bonus money. They'd been making trouble for 3 days straight, but nothing serious enough to warrant more than a warning from Hawkins. Not yet, anyway. The stranger pushed through the batwing doors, the sudden change from bright sunlight to saloon dimness hiding his features for a moment. He moved with the easy grace of a man accustomed to watching his surroundings, choosing a spot at the bar that gave him a clear view of both the room and the exit. When Jenny Miller, the young barmaid, approached for his order, he simply pointed to a bottle of good whiskey and held up one finger. "Ain't you got a tongue in your head, mister?" Lucky Harrison called out, already half drunk and looking for entertainment. The stranger paid him no mind, simply placing a silver dollar on the bar and pouring himself a careful measure of whiskey. "I'm talking to you, friend." Harrison's voice carried that particular edge that experienced men recognized as trouble brewing. The saloon grew quieter, conversations dying mid-sentence as the afternoon crowd sensed the shift in atmosphere. The stranger continued to ignore him, taking a small sip of his drink with deliberate calm. Sarah Cooper, watching from the doorway of her restaurant across the street, would later say she saw Lucky Harrison's face darken like a thunderhead rolling over the mountains. What happened next would spark a chain of events that would not only change Dogwood Creek forever, but would add another chapter to the growing legend of the man they called the Silent Shot. But first, blood would have to be spilled, and lessons would have to be learned about judging a man by his silence. Dawn broke over Dogwood Creek like a fever, the rising sun painting the sky in shades of angry red. Sheriff Hawkins had called an emergency meeting at the town hall, where the strange mix of morning lamplight and crimson sunshine cast double shadows across worried faces. The town council, along with key business owners and anyone handy with a gun, had gathered to discuss the coming storm. "Carter's gang isn't just a bunch of cowboys gone bad," Hawkins explained, his voice grave. "They're organized, well-armed, and mean as rattlers. Lucky Harrison's worked with them before. 3 years ago, they burned half of Silver Springs to the ground over a gambling dispute." The stranger stood at the back of the room, his presence drawing frequent glances from the assembled townspeople. His slate made its way through the crowd, passed from hand to hand, carrying a simple message. Anyone who wants to leave should go now. No shame in it. Deputy Wells, studying a crude map of the town spread across a table, looked up with a frown. 30 riders against what? Maybe 15 of us who can shoot straight? Those ain't good odds. The stranger's chalk scratched across his slate again. Numbers don't matter. Position does. Sarah Cooper, who'd been quietly observing, suddenly straightened. "The military signals. You're not just a scout, are you? You were training others, teaching them how to defend positions." The stranger nodded slowly, then wrote, "Confederate cavalry raids. Taught small towns how to resist superior numbers." Billy Chen, who'd survived 3 decades on the frontier through careful observation, studied the stranger's face. That? How you lost your voice? During war? But before the stranger could respond, quick Charlie Wilson, the livery stable owner, burst through the doors. "Dust cloud east of town," he reported, breathing hard. "Big one. Maybe hours ride out." The stranger's chalk moved with swift precision. "Need volunteers. Strong backs, steady hands. No guns required." What happened next would be remembered in Dogwood Creek for generations. The silent stranger transformed their town into a fortress, with the methodical efficiency of a master strategist. Under his direction, wagons were overturned at key intersections, creating choke points that would funnel riders into prepared fields of fire. The blacksmith's shop became an impromptu armory, where ammunition was distributed and weapons were checked. Most ingenious were the preparations nobody could see. The stranger had Sarah Cooper's kitchen staff cooking up massive pots of kitchen grease, which was then spread carefully in specific spots along the main street, places where riders would likely need to make sharp turns. Rooftops were prepared with piles of mining gravel, ready to be scattered to spook horses. "He's fighting smart," Sheriff Hawkins explained to the town council, "making sure any attack costs them more than they're willing to pay." The stranger's slate made its way around again. They'll expect resistance. Won't expect organization. Surprise is our advantage. Doc Matthews, watching the preparations from his office window, noticed something else. The stranger was positioning people according to their skills, not their fighting ability. Jenny Miller, known for her throwing arm at town picnics, was stationed with a basket of bottles filled with cook fire ash. The town's children were organized into messenger routes, using back alleys and crawl spaces they'd discovered in their games. Even Harrison's men in the jail seemed impressed by the efficiency of the preparations. Mexican Joe, watching through his cell window, muttered something that sounded almost like admiration. "Dios mío, it's like watching a conductor lead an orchestra of death." The stranger moved through it all like a ghost, his directions clear and precise despite never speaking a word. His calm seemed to infect the townspeople, replacing panic with purpose. When he finally returned to the town hall, his slate carried what might have been his longest message yet. Every man has a choice. Fight smart or fight desperate. We choose smart. We choose to survive. But as the dust cloud grew larger on the horizon, Sarah Cooper noticed something in the stranger's stance, a tension that hadn't been there during his duel with Harrison. She cornered Sheriff Hawkins near the telegraph office. "Tom, what aren't you telling us about him? About what Marshal Jensen's wire really said?" Hawkins glanced at the approaching dust cloud, then back at Sarah. "Jensen said Carter's gang did more than burn Silver Springs. They did something that turned a decorated war hero into a silent avenger. And now..." He adjusted his gun belt grimly. "Now they're riding straight toward their reckoning." The dust cloud resolved itself into riders just before noon, the sun's harsh glare glinting off rifle barrels and cartridge belts. Carter's gang approached with the confidence of men who'd never failed to take what they wanted, spreading out along the ridge overlooking Dogwood Creek, like wolves, sizing up a flock of sheep. Their leader, Jacob Carter himself, sat his big bay stallion at the center of the line, studying the town through a brass spyglass. "Mighty quiet down there," observed Rattler Pete, Carter's senior lieutenant. "Too quiet, you ask me." Carter lowered his spyglass, his scarred face creasing in thought. At first glance, Dogwood Creek appeared deserted. Doors closed, windows shuttered, streets empty except for a few tumbleweeds dancing in the hot wind. But 20 years of raids had taught him to spot the signs others might miss. Fresh wheel marks where wagons had been moved, subtle glints of metal from rooftops that might be more than just loose nails, the too careful arrangement of barrels and crates that could serve as cover. "Lucky's man said the town would fold easy," Rattler continued, shifting uneasily in his saddle. "Said one silent drifter was all we had to worry about." Carter spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "That one drifter put 2 bullets through Lucky's pride and damn near took his gun hand clean off. Man who can shoot like that." He paused, squinting at the town below. "Reminds me of stories I heard out of Silver Springs." Down in Dogwood Creek, the stranger moved like a shadow through the prepared positions, checking each detail one final time. His slate made its way among the defenders, carrying last-minute instructions. Let them enter. Wait for the signal. Aim for horses first. Sheriff Hawkins, positioned in the church bell tower with his Winchester, watched Carter's men through his own spyglass. They're splitting up, he reported quietly to Deputy Wells below. 4 groups, coming in from different directions. Just like our friend said they would. The stranger's military training showed in every aspect of the town's defense. He'd positioned Sarah Cooper's best shots in the upper floor of her restaurant, their rifles trained on the intersection where the kitchen grease would force riders to slow down. Jenny Miller and her crew of bottle throwers waited in the alley behind the general store, their ash-filled ammunition ready to create chaos and confusion. "Some of them boys look familiar," muttered Jorge, one of Harrison's imprisoned men, peering through his cell window. "Rode with Carter last spring when they hit that pay station in Colorado. Mean bunch. Ain't gonna let a few overturned wagons stop 'em." Mexican Joe, in the next cell, wasn't so confident. "You ever see somebody plan like this? Like he's playing chess while we're all still learning checkers?" The first group of riders entered town from the east, moving cautiously down the main street. Their horses' hooves made no sound in the dirt, adding to the eerie silence that had fallen over Dogwood Creek. They passed the livery stable, the saloon, the general store, all seemingly deserted. "Don't like this, boss?" one rider called softly to their leader. "Feel like we're being watched." The stranger stood in the shadows of the hotel's side entrance, his slate finding its way to Sheriff Hawkins one last time. Silver Springs was a mistake they made once. Today, they pay for it. Carter, watching from the ridge, suddenly straightened in his saddle. Something about the town's layout tugged at his memory. The positioned wagons, the subtle firing lanes, the carefully created choke points. He'd seen this before 3 years ago in a small Kansas town where his gang had lost 5 men to a brilliant defense organized by... "Pull back!" he shouted. But it was too late. The church bell rang once, sharp and clear in the afternoon air. In the next instant, Dogwood Creek erupted into carefully orchestrated chaos. Horses screamed as their hooves lost purchase on the greased street. Ash bombs exploded among the riders, blinding men and animals alike. Rifle fire erupted from a dozen hidden positions, each shot placed with surgical precision. The trap had been sprung, and Carter's gang was about to learn why the silent stranger's military reputation was just as fearsome as his skill with a gun. The battle for Dogwood Creek had begun, and it would be fought according to his rules. The first wave of Carter's men fell into chaos as the stranger's carefully laid trap sprung to life. Horses slipped and went down hard on the greased street, throwing riders into the dust. Those who managed to keep their seats found themselves caught in a deadly crossfire from the overlooking buildings. Within moments, the eastern approach to Dogwood Creek had become a killing ground. "It's him!" Carter shouted from his position on the ridge, recognition and old fear mingling in his voice. "The schoolmaster from Silver Springs, the one they said we'd killed?" Rattler Pete's face went pale beneath his trail dust. "Ain't possible, boss. That fire. Nobody could have survived that schoolhouse." But survive, he had. The stranger moved through the chaos like a ghost, his gun speaking with terrible precision. Each shot found its mark: horses' legs, weapons, ammunition belts. He wasn't trying to kill, but to disarm and disable, just as he had with Lucky Harrison. It was a display of skill that bordered on the supernatural. Sarah Cooper, reloading her rifle in the restaurant's upper floor, caught glimpses of him through the gunsmoke. "He's hurting them," she called out to her fellow defenders, "driving them right where he wants them." She was right. The stranger's tactics were forcing Carter's men to bunch up in the areas he'd prepared, where Jenny Miller and her crew waited with their ash bombs. The air filled with choking clouds as the bottles burst among the riders, the fine ash blinding men and horses alike. "Fall back," Rattler Pete yelled, trying to rally his men. "Get to the... His words cut off as a bullet from the stranger's Colt sent his gun spinning into the dust. Another shot knocked his hat off, the bullet passing so close it parted his hair. In the jail, Mexican Joe pressed against his cell window watching the battle unfold. "Santa Maria," he whispered. "Now I remember the stories. Silver Springs. They burned the schoolhouse with everyone inside. Teacher fought back, killed 6 men before they set the fire. They said the smoke took his voice but not his aim." Deputy Wells, picking off riders with careful shots from his position near the church, saw Carter himself finally enter the fray. The gang leader was shouting orders, trying to organize his men for a coordinated attack. But the stranger had anticipated this too. On his signal, the town's children, hidden safely in prearranged spots, began ringing bells and banging pots, creating a cacophony that made it impossible for Carter's men to hear their leader's commands. The confusion only grew as more ash bombs burst among them and more horses went down on the greased streets. "He ain't trying to kill us," one of Carter's men realized aloud, his voice carrying an edge of panic. "He's taking us apart piece by piece." The stranger appeared suddenly in the middle of the street, both guns drawn. His slate hung from his neck by a leather thong, a message clearly visible. "Remember Silver Springs?" Carter's face contorted with rage and recognition. "You!" he shouted, raising his rifle. "We burned you out. We heard you screaming as the smoke took your voice." The stranger's response was 2 simultaneous shots, one that took Carter's rifle from his hands, the other that knocked him from his saddle. The gang leader hit the ground hard, rolling in the dust as his remaining men scattered in panic. "Tom!" Sarah Cooper's warning shout drew everyone's attention to movement at Doc Matthews's office. Lucky Harrison had somehow gotten free, his bandaged hand clutching a derringer as he aimed at the stranger's back. But the silent avenger had known this was coming too. Without turning, he fired his left-hand Colt from the hip, the bullet striking Harrison's small gun with impossible precision and sending it flying. The move was so casual, so effortless, that it seemed more like an afterthought than a life-or-death response. The stranger turned back to Carter, who was struggling to his knees in the dirt. Another message appeared on the slate. "The children. The ones you trapped in the schoolhouse. I want you to say their names." Carter's face went ashen. The battle for Dogwood Creek wasn't just about territory or reputation. It was about justice long delayed, about a debt that had finally come due. And as the dust settled over the town, everyone present knew they were watching more than just a fight. They were witnessing a reckoning. The dust settled over Dogwood Creek like a shroud, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the battlefield that Main Street had become. Carter remained on his knees in the dirt, his face a mask of defiance despite the stranger's guns trained unwavering on his position. Around them, the remnants of his gang were being disarmed and rounded up by the townspeople, their fearsome reputation shattered by the precision of the stranger's trap. "You want their names?" Carter's laugh held an edge of hysteria. 3 years gone. "And you want their names now?" The stranger's chalk moved across his slate with deliberate precision. "You remembered them every night since. Now say them aloud." Sheriff Hawkins, approaching cautiously with his Winchester ready, saw something change in Carter's expression. A crack in the ruthless facade, a glimpse of the nightmares that must have haunted him since Silver Springs. "Emily Wilson," Carter whispered, his voice rough. 8 years old, sat in the front row, always had her hair in ribbons. His hands began to shake. "Thomas and James McCarty, the twins, used to finish each other's sentences." Sarah Cooper, watching from her position near the restaurant, noticed the stranger's grip tighten almost imperceptibly on his guns. Each name seemed to hit him like a physical blow, but his aim never wavered. "Mary Sullivan," Carter continued, the words coming faster now, like poison being purged. "Rebecca Hayes, Samuel Jackson, little Andy Peterson, who stuttered when he read aloud but could do sums faster than anyone. Mexican Joe, who'd been allowed out of his cell to help tend the wounded, crossed himself quietly, Madre de Dios, he muttered. They were just children. 12 of them. Lucky Harrison spoke up from where he sat propped against a water trough, his voice holding a new note of horror as understanding dawned. You were their teacher. The stranger's slate carried his response. And you trapped them in the schoolhouse. All because the town refused to pay your protection money. Deputy Wells, who'd moved to cover the remaining gang members, saw tears cutting tracks through the dust on Carter's face. The hardened outlaw leader was coming apart, the memories he'd tried to bury for 3 years clawing their way to the surface. We didn't mean for the fire to spread so fast, Carter's words tumbled out. Thought they'd have time to get out. Thought you'd save them. You always protected them before. But the doors wouldn't. The stranger's slate cut him off. Because you barred them from the outside. Made them listen to their teacher trying to break down the walls to save them. The revelation hit the watching crowd like a physical blow. Jenny Miller dropped her last ash bomb, the bottle shattering unnoticed in the dirt. Sarah Cooper pressed her hand to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. The smoke took my voice, the slate continued, but not before they heard my promises. To find you. To make you remember. To ensure you faced justice. Carter looked up, his face haunted. We heard you screaming their names, trying to answer them as the smoke got thicker. Thought for sure you died with them. How did you survive? The stranger's response appeared slowly, each word carved deep into the slate. I didn't. The man who taught them died in that fire. What walked out was something else. Something that could hunt you across 3 territories. Something that could wait and plan and never forget. Lucky Harrison, despite his wounds, began to laugh. A broken, desperate sound. All this time, all the stories about the silent judge, the ghost who hunts bad men, it was revenge for Silver Springs. The stranger's guns hadn't moved, but something in his stance shifted. His slate carried one final message. Not revenge. Justice. The law couldn't reach you. The courts couldn't touch you. But their names. Their names had power enough to hunt you to the ends of the earth. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting the street in blood-red light, everyone present knew they were witnessing more than just the end of a manhunt. This was the final chapter of a tragedy that had begun in flames and would end in judgment. Carter's gang had thought they'd killed a simple schoolmaster in Silver Springs. Instead, they'd created something far more dangerous, a silent avenger who'd spent 3 years preparing for this moment. The only question remaining was what form that justice would take, and whether Dogwood Creek would see another sunrise before it was done. The tension in Dogwood Creek's main street had grown thick enough to cut with a knife. Carter remained on his knees in the dust, the weight of his confessed sins visible in the slump of his shoulders. The stranger's guns hadn't wavered, but something had changed in his stance, a subtle shift that those who understood violence recognized as the moment before a killing strike. You've got every right, Sheriff Hawkins said softly, breaking the silence. Nobody here would blame you for ending it quick. His words carried the weight of frontier justice where sometimes the law had to turn a blind eye to allow a deeper justice to prevail. The stranger's slate appeared again, held high for all to see. The children deserve better than more bloodshed in their name. Sarah Cooper stepped forward, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. What they deserve is to be remembered, not as victims, but as children who brought light into this world, even if just for a little while. The stranger's next message surprised everyone. Tell us about them, Carter. Not how they died, how they lived. Carter's face crumpled, the last of his hardened outlaw facade cracking like sun-baked mud. Emily was teaching her little sister to read, had this primer book she carried everywhere. The twins, they were saving their pennies to buy their ma a fancy hat from the catalog. His voice broke. Andy Peterson, he couldn't say his own name without stuttering, but he could sing like an angel. Each memory seemed to physically pain him, as if the innocence of his victims had been burning him from the inside for 3 long years. The watching crowd found themselves caught between hatred for his crimes and an odd, uncomfortable pity for his obvious torment. Lucky Harrison, still propped against the water trough, saw something the others missed. "You've been running from their ghosts," he said quietly. "All this time, building your reputation, spreading terror. You were just trying to drown out their voices." The stranger's response was swift. Their voices deserved to be heard. He holstered his right-hand gun with fluid grace, never taking his eyes or his other weapon off Carter as he wrote, "The law will have you now. Every day in your cell, you'll tell their stories to anyone who will listen. That's your sentence, to keep their memories alive until your last breath." Deputy Wells had already moved forward with handcuffs when Lucky Harrison made his final desperate play. Despite his wounds, he lunged for a fallen rifle, bringing it up with the speed that had made him famous. "To hell with this," he snarled. "Carter, roll left." But the stranger had known, had planned for this moment just as he'd planned everything else. His holstered gun cleared leather again with impossible speed, even as his left-hand Colt kept Carter covered. 2 shots rang out as one, their thunder rolling across the street like judgment itself. The rifle flew from Harrison's hands, his wrists bleeding from carefully placed shots that would ensure he'd never handle a gun again. He collapsed back, his reputation as finished as his gunfighting days. "Dios mío," Mexican Joe whispered from the sidelines. "He really could have killed us all back in the saloon. Was just playing with Lucky that day." The stranger's slate carried his final message to Carter. "The territorial prison has a school for the guards' children. You'll be teaching there. Reading, writing, and the story of Silver Springs. Every day you'll look into innocent eyes and remember." As the sun began to set over Dogwood Creek, Carter was led away in chains, broken not by bullets but by the weight of memories he could no longer escape. The stranger watched him go, his stance finally relaxing as 3 years of pursuit reached its end. But for the people of Dogwood Creek, the day's events had transformed their understanding of justice and revenge. They had witnessed a man who had every right to claim a life choose instead to preserve memory, to turn a killer into a keeper of stories that needed to be told. The evening wind carried the distant sound of children's laughter from somewhere in town, a sound that seemed to make the stranger's shoulders straighten, as if remembering a classroom from long ago, where innocence had not yet been sacrificed to violence. As night settled over Dogwood Creek, the town began to process the day's extraordinary events. Doc Matthews worked tirelessly in his office, treating wounded members of Carter's gang alongside townspeople who'd caught stray bullets in the fighting. Every injury told the same story. Precise shots meant to disable rather than kill, a testament to the stranger's extraordinary skill and mercy. "Never seen anything like it," the doctor muttered as he bandaged another gunman's shoulder. 27 men hit, not a single killing shot among them. It's like he used his bullets for surgery instead of slaughter. In the jail, Sheriff Hawkins and Deputy Wells worked to process their numerous prisoners. Carter sat silent in his cell, his face haunted as he scribbled in a borrowed notebook, already beginning his sentenced task of recording the stories of Silver Springs' lost children. Lucky Harrison had been placed in a separate cell, his bandaged wrists a constant reminder of how thoroughly he'd been outmatched. "You knew, didn't you, Tom?" Sarah Cooper asked the sheriff as she brought coffee to the jail. "When that first telegraph came from Marshal Jensen, you knew who he really was." Hawkins nodded slowly. "Jensen's wire said he was more than just a teacher. Former Army sharpshooter, trained scouts during the war. After Silver Springs, he turned those skills to hunting men like Carter. Never kills unless he has no choice, but he's brought down some of the worst gangs in the territory." The stranger himself had taken up position on the hotel's porch, his guns finally holstered as he watched the town return to life. Jenny Miller brought him a plate of food, finding him writing in a small leather journal. He paused long enough to show her the page, a carefully drawn portrait of a young girl with ribboned hair. "Emily Wilson?" Jenny asked softly. The stranger nodded, then turned the page to reveal more portraits, The twins with their matching grins, little Andy Peterson at his desk, each face captured with loving detail. This wasn't just a record of loss, but a celebration of lives that had touched his soul. Mexican Joe, released from his cell to help with the cleanup, paused in his work to study the silent man on the porch. "They say you never killed none of Carter's old gang," he said carefully. "Just tracked them down one by one, shot the guns out of their hands, made them face the law. That true?" The stranger's slate appeared. "Death is quick. Justice should last." At the restaurant, Sarah Cooper hosted an impromptu gathering of townspeople, all eager to share their perspectives on the day's events. Billy Chen described how the stranger had positioned everyone according to their strengths, turning the town itself into a weapon. Deputy Wells explained the brilliant strategy that had divided and conquered a superior force. "But why here?" someone asked. "Why make his stand in Dogwood Creek?" Sarah, who'd been watching the stranger through her window, understood first. "Because we're like Silver Springs was. A small town trying to stand against men like Carter and Harrison. He didn't just come here for revenge. He came to prevent another tragedy." The stranger's next message, passed through the crowd on his slate, confirmed her insight. What happened there must never happen here, or anywhere. As midnight approached, a rider appeared on the eastern road, Marshal Jensen himself, drawn by his own telegraph's response. The lawman dismounted at the jail, his face grave as he studied the prisoners. But his expression softened when he saw the stranger on the hotel porch. 3 years of hunting," Jensen said quietly. 12 graves that needed justice. And you did it without adding a single new one." The stranger's response was to hand Jensen a stack of papers, detailed confessions from Carter and his men, enough evidence to ensure they'd never see freedom again. But more importantly, they contained the stories of Silver Springs, preserved now for history and memory. Word of the day's events was already spreading along the telegraph wires, adding to the legend of the silent judge. But for the people of Dogwood Creek, the legend was less important than the lesson. That true justice could be served without vengeance, that mercy could be stronger than hatred, and that sometimes the quietest voice could speak the loudest truths. The night wind carried the distant howl of coyotes, but for the first time in days, no one in town feared what the darkness might bring. They had witnessed something remarkable, not just the end of a manhunt, but the healing of an old wound that had festered across 3 territories. Dawn broke over Dogwood Creek the next morning with a different kind of silence, not the tense quiet of impending violence, but the peaceful stillness of justice served. Marshal Jensen supervised the loading of prisoners into reinforced wagons. Carter and his men bound for the territorial prison, while Lucky Harrison faced his own reckoning for years of violence. The stranger stood on the hotel porch, watching the proceedings with those pale, haunting eyes. His journal lay open beside him, its pages filled with the faces of children who would never grow older, preserved in careful strokes of pencil and memory. Sarah Cooper, bringing him a fresh pot of coffee, caught a glimpse of new additions to the book. Sketches of Dogwood Creek's defenders, as if he were collecting memories of life to balance those of loss. "Will you tell us your name?" she asked softly. "Your real name? From before Silver Springs?" His chalk moved across the slate. "That man died in the fire." Better to leave him there with his voice. Marshal Jensen, approaching after securing the prisoners, nodded in understanding. "Some men lose their voices to tragedy," he observed. "Others find new ways to speak. Your actions these past 3 years have said more than words ever could." The stranger's response was philosophical. "Silence teaches you to listen, to watch, to understand the weight of words, and the importance of choosing when not to use them." Around town, people were already beginning to rebuild from the previous day's conflict. Billy Chen supervised the removal of overturned wagons while Jenny Miller and her crew cleaned the streets of ash and grease. But there was something different in how they worked together. a new sense of confidence and community born from their shared victory. "You've given us more than just safety," Sheriff Hawkins told the stranger as they watched the town come back to life. "You've shown us how to stand together, how to fight smart instead of desperate." Deputy Wells, passing by with an armload of confiscated weapons, added his own observation. "And you did it all without having to kill a single man, even those who deserved it." The stranger's slate appeared again. "Death ends the lesson. Life forces them to learn it." Mexican Joe, who'd been helping with the cleanup, paused in his work. "What happens to them now? At the prison?" Marshal Jensen answered that one. "Carter will teach, just as promised. Every day he'll face children the same age as those he killed, see their innocence, remember his crimes. His gang will work in the prison gardens, growing things instead of destroying them. Even Harrison will have a chance to reflect on his choices while his hands heal." "And you?" Sarah asked the stranger. "Where will you go now?" His response was careful, thoughtful. "Where I'm needed. Other towns, other Carters. The territory is large, and justice often travels slow." But before he could write more, the sound of children's laughter echoed down the street. A group of young ones, finally allowed outside after the danger had passed, was playing marbles in front of the general store. The stranger watched them for a long moment, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. Sarah understood first. "We're building a school," she said quietly. "Town's been saving for it, but we haven't found a teacher yet." The stranger's hand hesitated over his slate, and for a moment everyone present held their breath. Finally he wrote, "Sometimes silence needs to find its voice again. Sometimes justice means building something new." That evening, as the sun set over Dogwood Creek, the stranger added one final sketch to his journal. The town itself, not as it was, but as it could be, with a new schoolhouse at its heart. Below the drawing, he wrote his first signature in 3 years, reclaiming a name that had been burned away in smoke and fire. The legend of the silent judge would live on in frontier stories, told in saloons and around campfires. But in Dogwood Creek, they would tell a different tale, of a man who turned tragedy into purpose, who proved that justice could be served without vengeance, and who found his voice again not in words, but in the laughter of children and the quiet courage of a town that had learned to stand together. They say the deadliest sound in the West isn't the rattler's warning or the coyote's howl. Sometimes it's the silence that comes before healing, before redemption, before a new chapter can begin. And in Dogwood Creek, that silence spoke louder than thunder.